the name of your bookshop?
Lighthouse.
Still Lighthouse. Ah.
We're just going to test the mics. Can you hear us? Can you hear this mic? Yes?
Hello, do you hear me?
Is that better?
I think that's better. That's better, right? Yeah.
Hello, and thank you everybody for joining us here today. I'm so glad you could all be with us. This is extraordinarily exciting and a privilege for us to host Raja Shehadeh and to give him time to just be in our presence and for us to be in his presence and to hear what he has to say. The format of this event will be very simple. I'm going to give a very brief introduction and then hand the stage to Raja. After Raja has spoken, has given us a reading, I will return and I will have a mic ready for audience questions. Please keep your questions brief. A question is a statement with a question mark at the end. I know that everyone is going to be extremely excited and have a lot to ask, and so we hope that you will be patient with each other, but also give each other the chance to speak. We have had so many book orders for this event that we're running low on stock for this specific book. However, we will be getting more. And so please register your interest for copies of Going Home. And if you have your copy, then Raja will sign it and is willing to sign it at the end. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to begin with this introduction and then hand over. So it gives me, the Radical Book Fair, Lighthouse Books, we are incredibly grateful to be able to welcome Raja Shehadeh to our fair. Raja is a lawyer and the founder of the pioneering Palestinian human rights organization al-Haq. He is an acclaimed and leading writer, and his many books include Strangers in the House, Occupation Diaries, and Palestinian Walks. He lives in Ramallah in Palestine, and Raja has a new book coming out next summer called We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I. And without further ado, I hand over.
Thank you. Thank you for the Lighthouse Bookstore and for Radical Book Fair for inviting me to this event and to give me a chance to speak about what is happening to al-Haq. In all the years at al-Haq, I never imagined that I will be standing like I am today to defend the organization I helped establish in 1979 from a charge of terrorism. As some of you might have known, on October 19, Benny Gantz, the Israeli Minister of Defense, issued an order under the Israeli anti-terrorism law designating al-Haq and 5 other non-governmental organizations in the West Bank as terrorists. What this meant was that anyone working for, supporting, or associated with these organizations could be arrested, detained, and charged with helping a terrorist organization and be subject to many years of imprisonment. Israel was flagrantly abusing this law. As a UN statement indicated, and I quote, "Counterterrorism must be in accordance with obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law, which include full respect for the rights to freedom of association and expression," unquote. I spoke and wrote at a number of venues after this happened and was impressed by the strong reaction from human rights organizations around the world. Such was the outrage that I believed Israel would back down and will not follow the action of the minister, with another by the Israeli commander of the West Bank adding these organizations to the list of proscribed organizations under the Defense Emergency Regulations of 1947, which the British honored us with in Palestine before they ended the infamous mandate over our country. However, not unusually, I was too optimistic. On November 7, the Israeli commander of the West Bank added al-Haq and the other 5 organizations to the list of proscribed organizations, rendering it illegal for them to continue to function openly in the West Bank. Israel's main objective, clearly, in doing so, in declaring the organizations as terrorists, is to starve these organizations out of existence by intimidating their funders. To prove they are serious, last Thursday, Juan Ruiz Sanchez, who worked for the Health Work Committee that provides medical services in the West Bank, was charged with terrorism in a military court. Let me review the history of how Israel treated al-Haq over the years, which I believe is telling about what it felt it could get away with over the past 40-some years. When the organization was established in 1979, Israel claimed that it was a cover-up for the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, which was then itself a proscribed organization. Yet, it left al-Haq alone. Al-Haq's earliest major activity was to document the extensive changes to local laws that Israel enacted in the occupied territories and in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. These military orders were designed to enable Israel to carry out acquisitions of land for the building of illegal settlements and giving rise to 2 communities living in the West Bank under 2 different systems of law and administration, which, as you know, is apartheid. In the West Bank and the Rule of Law, a study which Jonathan Kuttab and I authored in 1981, we showed that these orders had been withheld from public view. Israel was thus using secret legislation to break international law was a national embarrassment. Yet Israel did not respond by arresting us or ordering our organization closed. It commissioned a study called the Rule of Law in the Areas Administered by Israel, which attempted to rebut the claims we had made in our study. Such was the nature of the interaction then. That is not to say that over the years that followed, there was no harassment of the organization and its activists. I had my share, and many of the organization's field workers were detained on administrative detention without charge for long periods. On several occasions, the present director of the organization, Sha'wan Jabbareen, was tortured. Yet al-Haq was allowed to continue to function, and its offices were spared from attack by the army, even when just before this order, Defense of Children International Palestine had its offices raided and trashed. But not al-Haq. This impunity from physical attack continued throughout, including during the 2002 re-invasion of the West Bank by the Israeli army, when many official and non-governmental organization offices were entered and destroyed. al-Haq was spared. The government never felt so emboldened by its sense of total impunity that it would designate al-Haq a terrorist organization until now. That was why this designation of the organization as a terrorist organization came as a shock. The question is, why now? The most probable answer is that al-Haq has recently given strong support to the International Criminal Court at The Hague by supplying evidence for its investigation of war crimes by Israel during the 2014 Gaza war. Among the candidates who could be named in such an indictment would be Gantz, the Minister of Defense who issued the order, who was then Commander-in-Chief of the Israeli military in 2014. An investigation by Frontline Defenders, a Dublin-based human rights group, found that the mobile phones of Salah Hammouri, a Palestinian rights defender and lawyer whose Jerusalem residency status has been revoked, and 5 others, including Ghassan Halaiki, the field researcher for al-Haq, were hacked using Pegasus, NSO's signature spyware. In one case, the hacking was found to have occurred as far back as July 2002. Yet, despite using illegal means to obtain evidence, Israel has failed to submit convincing evidence to back up its claims to justify the terror label. Even Republican Jim McGovern, who co-chairs the Tom Lantos Human Rights Committee in the US, last Friday, noting the lack of evidence, urged the US Secretary of State to push the Israeli government to reverse the designation of the 6 Palestinian organizations as terrorist groups and to firmly and unambiguously denounce the move. Or it might be due to the utter sense of impunity that Israel feels, having established a pattern of an expanded definition of terrorism to include any legitimate challenge of the military occupation, which seems to be gaining acceptance around the world, coupled with its belief that it is a country above the law that can get away with anything. These might be the reasons why it has declared, done this amazing order. I happened to be here when this announcement was made, and so for myself, the silence, with few exceptions, of the establishment media in face of this shameful designation, hardly making it to the news. This is in sharp contrast to how it used to be some years ago. In the first quarter of this year, 292 houses in the West Bank, including Eastern Jerusalem, were demolished by Israeli forces. The olive-picking season this year, which has just ended, was marked by the worst incidents of settler violence against the farmers. This violence by the settlers, defended by the Israeli army, has led to scores of injuries and killings, including that of 13-year-old Muhammad Dahdas of Beta, who was shot dead on November 4 by an army bullet. It also included attacks on Palestinian homes in the South Hebron Hills and other places. In its most recent report, B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, wrote, quote, that settler violence is intrinsic to state violence and the West Bank land takeover, unquote. Yet in the face of all this violence against civilians, there was hardly any coverage in the UK media. It is then perhaps no wonder that Israel feels confident about the impunity from reprisals over this latest attack on the human rights organization operating in the West Bank. Over the years, al-Haq has won many prizes for its work in documenting and defending human rights. Many European countries contributed to building it up. The question now is whether it will be supported beyond condemnation by those who had valued its work. It was always a pioneering organization, and in this too, it will test the will of its supporters and whether there will be international tolerance for Israel's latest attack on Palestinian human rights. I will now read from Going Home, which is a book subtitled A Walk Through 50 Years of Occupation, that was published in 2018. And in the course of one day, I walked from my house through Ramallah, going through the various episodes that have happened in its streets and buildings and landscape, and describe these and describe their effect on me. And I end the book with returning home. In the course of this one-day walk, I passed the offices of al-Haq, and I will read to you now the passage about that experience of passing through near al-Haq. But I must say before that I mentioned Nadim Nuwara, who I had seen graffiti next to my house in the school where he was studying when he was shot dead by Israeli soldiers near Ramallah, in a place that used to be a wonderful place where in the winter a pond was collected water, and the birds stopped on their migration route through the region. Further down the street, I passed by al-Haq's headquarters, which have now expanded to occupy offices on both sides of the street. I saw the impressive large sign, al-Haq, Palestinian affiliate of the International Commission of Jurists. As I looked at the sign, part of me felt proud that I had been instrumental in establishing this organization. At the outset, our work conditions were difficult in ways that those now running the organization can hardly imagine. Sending reports without a functioning postal service, fax, or internet was an ordeal. Manuscripts had to be smuggled out, presenting great danger if they were discovered at the border points. Even getting a telephone line was problematic, and yet we pressed on. Sometimes I wonder whether all the massive amount of documentation and legal analysis the organization compiled over the years was of any real consequence. After 50 years, the occupation has not ended, and indeed has only become more entrenched. Still, it can be said that through its work, al-Haq has guaranteed that Israel's illegal practices have not gone unnoticed or undocumented. Reading what we have published will remove any mystery as to how Israel succeeded in bringing about the legal changes that now prevail. Information about Israeli practices is recorded in thousands of affidavits, copies of which have been sent to a safe archive abroad so that they cannot be seized by soldiers and destroyed. Part of me is proud to have been part of that struggle, but I remain skeptical that we might have deceived ourselves into thinking human rights activism had real promise, because the violations have only continued and indeed increased. In terms of stopping more human rights violations, our struggle has ended as a futile endeavor. All my work in human rights could not deter the soldier from killing 17-year-old Nadim Nuwara. So sure was his killer that he would not be prosecuted that he did not hesitate to publicly declare that he had killed this young man out of boredom. Nor did it deter the settlers from taking more Palestinian land and using it for agriculture, employing the very people they took it from, abandoning the oft-repeated fiction that Israel was taking Palestinian lands for security reasons. al-Haq is now preparing the case for presentation to the International Criminal Court against Israel for war crimes. If there can be success in one case, this would make a huge difference and would surely deter more soldiers from so brazenly violating human rights, Palestinian human rights. Thank you.
About 15 to 20 minutes for questions. Again, a question is a short statement with a question mark at the end. Can I see hands up if anyone has a question? Okay, I can start us off. Everybody, rack your brains. This is your time. You've said that you feel a skepticism and perhaps a disheartening in seeing that war crimes and crimes against humanity have not stopped in the time that you have worked at al-Haq. But I wondered how you felt about perhaps this year and the activism from younger Palestinians and what they have generated. And I wondered how you felt about that.
You know, I must say that I was too optimistic and felt that human rights would make a real difference and would have a greater political difference. And now I realize that human rights is a very important activity, but it is a long-term thing. And without documenting, without making known these violations, Israel would be able to get away with them and people will forget entirely, and then there will be no sense of how things have happened, and that would be detrimental. As long as you have a record of what happened and how it happened, then at some point people will pick it up and make a difference and change, make a political change. But it's really political change that will ultimately bring about the change, and human rights is an instrument towards that goal, but it's not an end in itself. And that is something that I had failed to grasp when I started my work with human rights, thinking that our work would make all the difference and would really bring an end to the occupation. It didn't and wouldn't.
Any hands?
One instance, and I'm just curious about its general stance, if it is critical of the Israeli state, and what sort of relationship al-Haq has with it.
al-Haq has very good relationship with B'Tselem and other Israeli human rights organizations. And B'Tselem has done tremendously good work over the years. More recently, it published a report saying that apartheid is there not only in the occupied territories but in Israel in general, and that has made a big shift in the thinking of so many people in Israel and around the world who had always thought that as long as the violations are restricted to the occupied territories and there might be apartheid in the occupied territories, this left Israel intact and unaffected. B'Tselem came with this report saying, no, it's one state, Israel and the occupied territories, because Israel rules the occupied territories, and just as if it is part of it. And so you cannot divide the violations and say there's apartheid only in the occupied territories. It's apartheid in Israel, and this has made a huge difference. So B'Tselem has changed over the years and become very confident and outright, and has said very important things which made all the difference and is making all the difference. So it's a very respectable human rights organization.
It was really moving. You point to the kind of disillusionment of human rights having an immediate impact, pointing towards it having a long-term impact. And I guess I was thinking a little bit about how we can actually have an impact, and more in relation to the role of states such as America funding Israel.
I can hardly follow.
Sorry, I think it's
Maybe
the
you should remove your...
Thank you. I wanted to ask more specifically about, I guess, for us being in the UK, how we can make a difference, and specifically with relation to international countries' role in supporting Israel, for example, America funding Israel, and how much of a driver that now is to the continuing oppression.
Well, I think the big difference can be made, the National Criminal Court is investigating Israeli practices. And this country, as well as America, as well as the United States, are trying to fight the International Court and not allow it to go on and to charge and to put limitations on its officers and so on. And I think by working with your government to stop that harassment of the International Court and encourage it rather than discourage it to take up action against Israeli violations of law and indictments of criminal activity, that would be greatly helpful.
Sorry. Thank you so much for the talk. I just wanted to ask I attended your talk last year as well on the anniversary of Beneath the Shifting Sands, kind of like 10 years after the Arab Spring.
No, sorry, I can't understand.
So I just thinking about the book that you published a while back, Beneath the Shifting Sands, and kind of like the reflections that you had last year, 10 years after the Arab Spring. I was wondering, what do you, just your thoughts on the stances of the Arab states and their consistent normalization of relationships with Israel, what that means, and especially kind of like considering just how Egypt actively profits off of kind of like maintaining some sort of peace.
I think that those who had expected Arab states to be of help to the Palestinians were very disappointed by the stance of the Arab states in normalizing with Israel. But I was not one of them. I always realized, and reading history you realize, that the Arab states have always really spoken rhetorically in favor of the Palestinians, but in terms of action didn't support the Palestinians in action. And they had, for many years, had relations, clandestine relations with Israel, which now have simply come to the open. And at the same time, what hasn't changed is the fact that the people, the public in these states is definitely sympathetic to the Palestinians, but of course, because of the lack of democracy in these states, the public doesn't really count. And so these states are openly making relations with Israel. And in a way, it's better to be in the open than to be clandestine. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter because they were not of help before, and they're not going to be of help now.
Hello, thank you very much for this. It's a great honor to meet you. I'm also a human rights lawyer. I'm Palestinian, but I was born and raised in Chile. For those that don't know, Chile is the home of the vast majority of Palestinians outside the Arab world. And in relation to the previous question, I wanted to ask you, to your question, what's the role of your opinion of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS?
In a recent article in the daily newspaper Haaretz, which is usually very good on these questions, one of its economic editors, called Rosenberg, said that what Israel has to worry about most is in the BDS is the D, and this investment, and that there is a lot of this investment taking place without making too much noise, but it's beginning to be effective economically towards Israel. And he quoted from a number of funds which have billions of dollars who have disinvested, disengaged from Israel, and he showed that the number is increasing. So I'm not an economist, I don't know, and I don't have an opinion on this, but I think I take his point that this is beginning to be very important.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. Besides all the negative consequences there are for the human rights organizations that are now declared terrorist groups, I'm wondering if there's also, and I don't want to use the word positive, but in a way it becomes now very clear what the war on terror is like really about, and what the concept of terrorist is used for. So can we get something out of that? I'm wondering, what do you think?
You know, I've always thought that this use of the term terrorism so loosely is a very bad thing, because of course there is real terrorism, but not every action that is criminal is terrorist, and not any resistance to the occupation is terrorist. This is very dangerous, and you might be right that by expanding to this extent the use of this term terrorism to include respectable human rights organizations and non-governmental organizations, they show the absurdity of that use. You might be right. But at the same time, the consequences for these organizations is very dire. That's not to be underestimated. And perhaps it's too high a price to pay.
Do you have any sense of the younger generations who've grown up only under the occupation? Do you have any sense of them being a force for change now?
I think the younger generation, to the extent that I'm able to speak about the younger generation, have a very difficult challenges ahead of them. In my time of the resistance to the occupation, it was clear-cut. There was an occupation, and we had to end the occupation. Now, even the occupation itself has become so much more complicated and so much more varied, and the Oslo Accords of 1993-95 made it very difficult to understand the legality of things, because Israel has been very careful to arrange things so that it seems one way when it is really another way. And so, at the same time, the creation of the Palestinian Authority, which is aligned in many ways to Israel, has further complicated the matters. And so they have a very hard time. But at times they dismiss so many of the efforts of the past. So for example, now there was the anniversary of the 1991 Madrid Peace Conference, and many young people think that this was a terrible thing, they don't want to hear about it. But they fail to see that at the time it was very promising, and it could have been different had it been pursued in a different manner. So sometimes the young people just dismiss outright so many things, and it is for us, people who have been through these experiences, to explain how things were and to put things in a greater context. And at the same time, times have changed, and now there is social media. Now social media, I'm not part of social media. I don't have Facebook or anything of that sort, but as far as I understand it, social media is two-faced. On the one hand, it distracts people from realizing the effect they are having, because they read what they like to read, what they agree with, and they think, oh, there's so many people who are, for example, pro-Palestinian and writing about all these things and so on, so it must be very good. But then they don't realize that it is preaching to the converted, really, and that at the same time, when all these things are being written on Facebook, in the media, which outside media, which establishment media and so on, which many people still read, there's nothing at all being mentioned, just as in the case of the al-Haq designation of terrorism. Very little has been said on the media. I'm sure Facebook is full of denunciations and explanations about that, but it's read by just the converted. So there is that problem with the young people who are very distracted now, sometimes negatively, by social media. But the hope still is with the young people. What can we say?
Can I ask you, you mentioned about the Arab countries. Obviously, the population of the Arab countries are not agreeing with their government. There is no much democracy. Do you think give Israel the more green light to be more aggressive in their actions in the occupied territories? Or do you think there will be sort of promises that they will be more more in the future to be helpful for the peaceful settlement of two-state solution?
I think by and large they are more encouraging of Israel to be more abrasive and extreme in its actions. And it also gives Israel the sense of safety and security that we are now at peace with most of the Arab states, so why should we bother with the Palestinians, and why should we try to make peace with the Palestinians, which is completely contrary to the way it was before, because previously it was understood that the Palestinians are the way towards peace with the rest of the Arab world. Now that card, so to speak, has been lost. And so Israel has become more aggressive, as we have seen in the past few years, and that is partly because of the policies with the Arab states. But I must say that what is very disturbing is that the Israeli education system is such that it doesn't bring out the humanity of the Palestinians, so that the Israelis, for example, when the designation of the al-Haq became as a human rights or as a terrorist, we heard very few voices, except for very few people and organizations, but the public at large accepted that order by their government. And that's because they don't think of the Palestinians as human beings who are capable of doing human rights. They think that they always are a cover for terrorist organizations. This is contrary to how the Israeli public responded when there was claims of treason against B'Tselem. There was an uproar because B'Tselem is an Israeli organization, but no such uproar in the case of al-Haq, because it is deemed to be likely to be terrorist, as the government is saying. So there is a deterioration in the perception amongst Israelis of the Palestinians, and that is increased by the present relations with the Arab world.
You've got a question.
I think were you saying that al-Haq is preparing a case for the international court, and the British government is trying to sabotage that? I think you.
Individuals cannot prepare a case. It is al-Haq is giving evidence to the court to prepare its case against Israel for the war crimes it committed in the 2014 Gaza invasion. And the UK government and the US government are trying their best to deter the case from continuing. That's what I was saying.
I was curious as to what's the UK government's justification for doing that? Do you know? Or?
I don't know really, but I think they always say that Israel is highlighted, and they should be paying attention to other places in the world, not to Israel. But I'm not sure exactly what is their justification in this case, if they have to give any.
Thank you so much for coming. Please remember that you can get your book signed. Please remember that you can register your interest for another copy. And finally, please, a huge round of applause for Raja.
Thank you.